The rain hammered against the Georgian windows of the Guardian's offices as Sarah Chen stared at the photograph on her desk, her father's last smile before the verdict that changed everything. 20 years had passed, but the pain remained as fresh as London's morning drizzle. Her fingers trembled slightly as she closed the laptop containing 3 years of meticulous investigation, evidence that could shatter the foundations of British justice itself. "Sarah, you need to see this." Emma Walsh's voice crackled through the encrypted phone line. The former detective inspector's words carried an urgency that made Sarah's heart race. "The Adeyemi trial. They're moving to closing arguments tomorrow. Harrington's accelerated everything." Sarah's reflection in the rain-streaked window showed a woman transformed by purpose. At 35, the daughter of David Chen, wrongfully convicted of embezzlement and died in Pentonville prison, had become one of London's most fearless investigative journalists. But this story was different. This wasn't just about justice. It was about redemption for every family destroyed by a system that claimed to be blind but saw only what it wanted to see. The newsroom buzzed with the controlled chaos of deadline pressure, but Sarah moved through it like a ghost, her mind focused on the USB drive in her pocket. It contained recordings from inside the jury deliberation room, illegal, explosive, and undeniable proof that Judge William Harrington had orchestrated verdicts before trials even began. The same man who, as a young prosecutor, had buried evidence that could have saved her father. James Morton intercepted her near his office, his silver hair catching the fluorescent lights. "Sarah, we need to talk about your Harrington piece." His eyes, usually warm with paternal concern, now held something else: fear. "The legal department has concerns, serious ones." "James, we have proof." Sarah's voice carried the weight of 3 years of sleepless nights. "Marcus Adeyemi is about to become another victim. He's a brilliant doctor, a father, and he's innocent. His daughter, Amara, is only 15, the same age I was when they took my father." The editor's face softened momentarily before hardening again. "The Lord Chief Justice called me personally, Sarah. This isn't just about one story anymore. They're threatening the entire paper with contempt charges. We could lose everything." Sarah felt the familiar isolation closing in, the same walls that had trapped every whistleblower before her. But in her mind, she saw Amara Adeyemi's face from the courtroom gallery, watching her father being systematically destroyed by lies dressed as law. The girl's eyes held the same confusion and dawning horror that Sarah had felt 2 decades ago. "Then we lose everything," Sarah said quietly, her hand instinctively moving to the USB drive. "But James, if we don't publish this, how many more Marcus Adeyemis will there be? How many more daughters will grow up knowing the system failed their fathers?" The rain intensified, drumming against the windows like an accusation. In the distance, Big Ben chimed 6 o'clock, its sound carrying across the Thames like a countdown. Sarah thought of her mother, Liu Chen, still setting a place at dinner for a man who would never come home, still believing that British justice would eventually acknowledge its mistake. As she walked back to her desk, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "Stop digging or join your father." The threat was crude, but effective. They were watching. But Sarah had learned something from 20 years of grief. Fear loses its power when you've already lost everything that matters. She opened her laptop again and began typing. "The British justice system has a cancer at its heart, and his name is Judge William Harrington." Each keystroke was a declaration of war, each word a step closer to either vindication or destruction. Tomorrow, Dr. Marcus Adeyemi would face a verdict that had been decided weeks ago in shadowy meetings and whispered conversations. But tonight, Sarah Chen would ensure the world knew the truth, even if it cost her everything. Marcus Adeyemi's hands, the same hands that had saved countless lives in operating theatres across London, now shook as he adjusted his tie in the courthouse bathroom mirror. The man staring back at him looked older than his 43 years, worn down by 18 months of legal persecution, that had stripped away everything except his determination to protect his daughter from the truth about British justice. "Daddy, you're innocent." "That has to mean something," Amara had said that morning, her school uniform impeccable despite the chaos of their lives. The brightness in her eyes, her mother's eyes, still held faith in a system that Marcus now knew was designed to consume people like them. People whose success challenged comfortable narratives about who belonged in Britain's corridors of power. The bathroom door opened, and Sarah Chen entered, her presence immediately commanding despite her slight frame. Marcus had seen her in the gallery every day, taking notes with an intensity that suggested she understood something others missed. "Dr. Adeyemi, I'm Sarah Chen from The Guardian. I know what Judge Harrington is doing to you." Marcus's first instinct was suspicion. Journalists had already destroyed his reputation, printing allegations as facts, turning his life's work into tabloid fodder. But something in Sarah's eyes, a shared understanding of systemic betrayal, made him pause. "My father was David Chen," she continued, her voice steady but laden with emotion. "Harrington was the prosecutor who sent him to prison for a crime he didn't commit. He died there when I was 17. I've spent 3 years investigating Harrington and your case. It's not about medical malpractice. It's about sending a message to every successful immigrant who dares to excel in British society." The truth of her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The patient who had died, elderly Margaret Thornton, had been suffering from a rare genetic condition that no standard screening would have caught. Marcus had followed every protocol, consulted with colleagues, documented everything meticulously. But Harrington had systematically excluded each piece of exculpatory evidence, allowing only the narrative of a careless foreign doctor to reach the jury. "I have recordings," Sarah whispered, glancing at the door. "Conversations between Harrington and jury members before your trial even began. They've already decided you're guilty. The closing arguments tomorrow are just theatre." Marcus felt his knees weaken. He thought of his late wife, Grace, who had believed so deeply in their adopted country that she'd named their daughter after the Yoruba word for precious, but spelled it the English way to help her fit in. Grace had died of cancer 2 years ago, still believing in British fairness, never knowing the system would come for her husband next. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse with suppressed rage and grief. "Because tomorrow, when they read that verdict, I want you to know that someone fought for you. Someone saw the truth. And because I need you to be strong for Amara. She's going to need her father's strength when this story breaks." Sarah handed him a small card with a phone number. "Emma Walsh. She's a former detective inspector who Harrington destroyed for asking too many questions. She'll help protect Amara when things get difficult. And they will get difficult." As Marcus watched Sarah leave, he felt something shift inside him. For months, he'd been drowning in isolation, convinced that his destruction was personal, unique to his circumstances. But now, he understood he was part of a pattern, a deliberate system of oppression, dressed in wigs and robes, speaking Latin phrases, while destroying lives with surgical precision. That evening, Marcus sat with Amara in their modest flat in Hackney. A far cry from their former home in Hampstead, sold to pay legal fees. She was doing homework, her concentration absolute despite everything. "Amara," he said softly, "tomorrow, whatever happens in court, I need you to remember the truth doesn't always win immediately. Sometimes it takes time and courage and people willing to sacrifice everything." She looked up at him with those intelligent eyes that reminded him so much of Grace. "Like that journalist who's always watching from the gallery? Sarah Chen?" Marcus smiled despite everything. His daughter noticed everything, absorbed everything, just like her mother. "Yes, exactly like her. She lost her father to the same system that's trying to take me, but she didn't let it break her. She turned her pain into purpose." Judge William Harrington stood in his oak-paneled chambers at the Old Bailey, surveying the domain he'd controlled for 15 years. The portraits of his predecessors watched from the walls, stern faces of men who'd upheld the law with unwavering certainty. But Harrington knew something they didn't. The law was merely a tool, and those who wielded it determined its justice. His phone buzzed with a message from Detective Chief Inspector Robert Thornley. Chen knows about the recordings, moving to containment. Harrington felt a flicker of annoyance rather than concern. Journalists had threatened him before, but the system always protected its own. The system had to protect its own, or everything would crumble. The Adeyemi case had been carefully chosen. A successful Nigerian doctor, beloved by his patients, with an impeccable record, until Margaret Thornton died on his operating table. That her death was unavoidable, that 3 independent reviews had cleared Adeyemi of any wrongdoing, was irrelevant. The narrative was what mattered, foreign doctors putting British lives at risk. It played perfectly in the current political climate, and Harrington's subtle jury management would ensure the right verdict. A knock interrupted his thoughts. His clerk entered, followed by James Morton, editor of The Guardian. Morton looked haggard, torn between competing loyalties. "William," he began, using the familiarity of their Oxford days, "Sarah Chen is going to destroy herself over this. Can't you show some mercy? The Adeyemi verdict, surely there's room for doubt." Harrington poured 2 glasses of whiskey from his crystal decanter, a gift from the Lord Chancellor. "James, you've always been too sentimental. Chen is chasing ghosts. Her father was guilty, the evidence was clear, and Adeyemi, well, sometimes examples must be made for the greater good." "The greater good," Morton's voice cracked with disgust. "William, I've seen Sarah's evidence. The recordings, the jury tampering. If this comes out, it won't just destroy you. It'll shake public faith in the entire justice system." Harrington smiled coldly. "Which is exactly why it won't come out. You're going to kill the story, James. Because if you don't, I'll ensure The Guardian faces contempt charges that will bankrupt the paper. Every journalist you employ will become unemployable. Is one story worth destroying hundreds of careers?" As Morton left, shoulders slumped in defeat, Harrington turned back to the window overlooking the London skyline. Below, protesters had gathered, holding signs reading, "Justice for Dr. Adeyemi." He recognized some faces, patients whose lives Marcus had saved, colleagues who knew his competence, but crowds were easy to dismiss. The law spoke louder than placards. His phone rang. Emma Walsh's name appeared on the screen. A surprise, considering he'd effectively ended her police career 5 years ago. "Judge Harrington." Her voice was steady, controlled. "I'm calling to inform you that copies of certain recordings have been secured in multiple locations. If anything happens to Sarah Chen or Marcus Adeyemi, they will be released simultaneously to every major news outlet in Europe." The threat was clear, but Harrington had played this game too long to be rattled by a disgraced detective. "Emma, you always were too emotional for police work. Whatever fantasies you and Ms. Chen have constructed, they'll evaporate in the cold light of legal scrutiny. Tomorrow, justice will be served." But as he hung up, Harrington felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. Sarah Chen wasn't like other journalists he'd intimidated into silence. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. Her father's case had been his first major victory as a prosecutor, the foundation of his entire career. If that foundation cracked, everything built upon it would collapse. He walked to his safe and pulled out a file marked D. Chen, 1999. Inside were documents he'd kept hidden for 20 years, evidence that David Chen had been framed by a colleague who'd needed a scapegoat for embezzlement. Harrington had known the truth even then, but prosecuting Chen had been politically expedient, a way to show toughness on white-collar crime in immigrant communities. Now, the daughter had come for him, armed with truth and fury. Tomorrow's verdict would proceed as planned. It had to. Marcus Adeyemi would be found guilty, another victory for British justice. But Harrington knew that verdicts in courtrooms were no longer the only judgments that mattered. The court of public opinion was about to convene, and Sarah Chen would be its prosecutor. Liu Chen arranged the photographs on her mantelpiece with the same precision she brought to everything in her life, each frame exactly 2 inches apart, each image carefully chosen to tell the story of a family that refused to be broken. The largest photo showed David on their wedding day, his smile radiant with the promise of a future that would never come. Beside it, Sarah's graduation photo from Cambridge, her eyes carrying the same determination that had once burned in her father's. The small flat in Whitechapel was a far cry from their former home in Richmond, but Liu had made it beautiful with careful attention and modest means. Every surface gleamed, every cushion perfectly placed. Order imposed on a world that had shown her only chaos. The smell of jasmine tea filled the air as she prepared for Sarah's visit, though her daughter came less frequently now, consumed by the investigation Liu pretended not to know about. When Sarah arrived, she looked exhausted, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. "Mama," she said in Mandarin, their private language when emotions ran too deep for English, "I need to tell you something about Papa's case." Liu's hands stilled on the teacup she was holding. For 20 years, she'd built walls around that pain, choosing to believe that David's innocence would someday be recognized through proper channels, through patience and faith in the system that had failed them. But looking at her daughter's face, she knew those walls were about to crumble. "I know who destroyed him, Mama. Judge Harrington, he was the prosecutor. He had evidence that Papa was innocent, but he buried it. And now he's doing the same thing to Dr. Adeyemi. I have proof, but..." Sarah's voice broke, the weight of 3 years of investigation finally overwhelming her composure. Liu set down the teacup with deliberate calm and took her daughter's hands. They were ink-stained from constant writing, trembling with exhaustion and rage. "Sarah, my precious daughter, I have something to tell you. I've always known your father was innocent, but I also knew that knowing and proving are different things in this country." She stood and walked to an old wooden chest, a wedding gift from David's parents. From it, she pulled a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "Your father wrote everything down. Every meeting, every conversation, every moment he began to suspect he was being framed. He gave this to me the night before his arrest, told me to keep it safe until the right moment." Sarah opened the journal with shaking hands, reading her father's meticulous notes. Names, dates, conversations, a complete record of his growing awareness that his colleague, Thomas Whitman, was embezzling funds and setting David up to take the fall. And there, in the final entry, "William Harrington knows the truth. He visited Whitman privately. They've made a deal." "Why didn't you ever show this to anyone?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. "Because I had you to protect," Liu answered simply. A widow with a young daughter, fighting the British legal system, they would have destroyed us both. So I chose survival over justice. I chose to give you a future, even if it meant living with injustice. But now you're strong enough to fight this battle. You have allies, resources, a voice people will hear." Liu moved to the window, looking out at the London skyline that had been both haven and prison. "Dr. Adeyemi came to see me last week," she said quietly. "He didn't know I was your mother. He was just looking for someone who understood what it meant to lose everything to British justice. His daughter Amara was with him, such a bright girl, so much like you at that age, still believing that truth matters." Sarah joined her mother at the window. "It does matter, Mama. Even if the system doesn't recognize it, truth matters." "I know, my darling. That's why I've been visiting the families, all the families Harrington has destroyed over the years. There are 17 of us who meet quietly, supporting each other. Tomorrow, when the verdict comes, we'll all be there, not protesting, just witnessing. Let Harrington see the faces of those he's wronged. Let the world see that we remember." That evening, as they sat together going through David's journal, Liu felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years. Hope. Not for David's vindication, that chance had passed, but for the possibility that his death might mean something, that his sacrifice might prevent other families from enduring their pain. "Your father would be so proud," Liu whispered, watching Sarah transcribe notes with fierce concentration. He always said truth was like water. It finds a way through every barrier, no matter how strong. The Old Bailey's Court 1 had never felt smaller to Sarah as she sat in the press gallery, her laptop open, fingers poised over keys that would either unleash truth or destroy her career. Below, Marcus Adeyemi sat rigid in the dock, his daughter Amara in the public gallery, surrounded by Liu Chen and the other families, a quiet army of the wronged, bearing witness to what everyone knew would be a predetermined verdict. Judge Harrington entered with his usual theatrical authority, his robes billowing like the wings of a bird of prey. His eyes swept the courtroom and paused on Sarah, a flicker of something, concern, anger, crossing his patrician features before returning to practice neutrality. The jury filed in, 12 citizens who didn't know they'd been pawns in a larger game. Their deliberations secretly recorded, their biases carefully cultivated. As the jury reached a verdict, Harrington's voice resonated with false solemnity. The foreman stood, a middle-aged man named Patterson, whom Sarah's investigation had revealed was Harrington's cricket club associate. "We have, Your Honor." Sarah's phone vibrated. Emma Walsh, security footage from the jury room uploaded to secure server. "Ready on your signal." Another message from James Morton. "Board has approved publication. God help us all." On the charge of criminal negligence resulting in death, how do you find the defendant? Time seemed to slow. Sarah saw Amara grip Liu's hand, saw Marcus close his eyes in prayer, saw Harrington lean forward slightly, anticipating his moment of triumph. Her finger hovered over the publish button for her article, 3 years of investigation distilled into words that would shake the foundations of British justice. Guilty. The word fell like a hammer, but before Harrington could speak, Sarah pressed the button. Within seconds, her article flooded across the Guardian's website. Exclusive. Secret recordings reveal decades of judicial corruption in British courts. The embedded audio files began playing automatically, Harrington's voice clear and unmistakable, discussing how to manipulate jury selection, how to ensure convictions regardless of evidence. Phones throughout the courtroom began buzzing as the story went viral. The BBC News Alert, Sky News, even international outlets picking it up within minutes. The bailiff looked to Harrington for guidance, but the judge sat frozen, watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "Your Honor," Marcus Adeyemi stood, his voice carrying the dignity that 18 months of persecution hadn't broken. "I would like to make a statement." Harrington's mouth opened to object, but no words came. The courtroom had become a theater of the absurd, the verdict meaningless in the face of revealed corruption. "My daughter asked me this morning if being innocent mattered," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "I told her it did, even when the system fails to recognize it. Today, you have proven me wrong, Your Honor, but Ms. Chen has proven me right. Truth does matter, just not in your courtroom." The public gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in something more powerful, coordinated testimony. Liu Chen stood first. "David Chen, my husband, innocent, died in prison 2003. Then another. "Michael Patterson, my son, innocent, convicted 2008. One by one, 17 families stood, stating names and dates, a litany of lives destroyed by Harrington's career. Harrington gavelled frantically for order, but the damage was done. Court reporters were typing furiously, cameras from the overflow room capturing everything. The foreman of the jury had pulled out his phone, his face pale as he read Sarah's article, realized how he'd been manipulated. "This court is in recess," Harrington declared, fleeing to his chambers. But Sarah knew there was no escape from what she'd unleashed. The recordings were everywhere now, shared thousands of times per minute, commented on by legal experts, politicians, celebrities. The hashtag Justice for Adeyemi was trending globally. Emma Walsh appeared at Sarah's side. The Attorney General's office just called. They're launching an immediate investigation into all of Harrington's cases. Marcus's conviction will be suspended, pending review. Sarah felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a strange emptiness. 3 years of her life had led to this moment, but it wouldn't bring her father back, wouldn't restore the years Marcus had lost fighting false charges, wouldn't give Amara back her innocence about the world's fairness. She looked down at the courtroom where Amara was hugging her father, both crying, both understanding that vindication and victory were different things. The system had been exposed, but at such cost. How many families had been destroyed while she gathered evidence? How many Marcus Adeyemis had she been unable to save? 48 hours after the verdict, London's legal establishment was in chaos. The Lord Chief Justice had suspended Harrington pending investigation. Prosecutors were reviewing 20 years of cases, and Sarah Chen sat in a secure hotel room under police protection, the death threats having escalated beyond anonymous messages to credible plans of violence. Emma Walsh paced by the window, her police instincts still sharp, despite years away from the force. The Serious Fraud Office wants your testimony tomorrow. They're building a criminal case against Harrington and at least 6 other judges who were part of his network. Sarah stared at the wall of documents she'd assembled, photographs, transcripts, evidence that painted a picture of systemic corruption so vast it seemed impossible that it had remained hidden for so long. But she knew better. It hadn't been hidden. It had been ignored, protected by those who benefited from its existence. Her phone rang. Marcus Adeyemi's name appeared on the screen. "Sarah, I'm at your mother's flat. You need to come. She's had a collapse. The stress, the memories, the ambulance is here." The world tilted. Sarah had been so focused on justice for the dead that she'd forgotten to protect the living. Emma drove her through London's rain-slicked streets, sirens wailing ahead of them. At the hospital, Sarah found Marcus and Amara in the waiting room, their faces etched with concern. "She kept saying your father's name," Marcus said softly. When the paramedics arrived, she was holding his journal, calling for him like he was still alive. A doctor appeared, young, South Asian, with kind eyes that reminded Sarah of her father's. "Your mother has had a severe anxiety episode, possibly triggered by recent stress. She's stable but disoriented. She keeps asking for David, insisting he's supposed to pick her up from work." Sarah entered the hospital room to find Lou small and fragile against white sheets, her eyes distant, lost in a time 20 years past. "David," she whispered in Mandarin, "did you remember to pick up Sarah from school?" The weight of what Sarah had done crashed over her. In pursuing justice for her dead father, had she destroyed her living mother? The story that had shaken Britain's legal system had also shattered the careful peace Lou had built around their family tragedy. Amara appeared at her elbow, this remarkable teenager who'd watched her own father's destruction with such grace. "My mother died in a hospital like this," she said quietly. "She spent her last days worried about what would happen to us. Don't let your mother's last memories be of fear and fighting. She deserves peace." Over the following days, as the Harrington scandal dominated headlines and Parliament called for judicial reform, Sarah barely left her mother's bedside. Lou drifted between past and present, sometimes recognizing Sarah, sometimes seeing only the young daughter who'd needed protection from a cruel world. James Morton visited, bringing news that The Guardian's story had won international recognition, that journalism schools were already teaching it as a masterclass in investigative reporting. "You've changed British justice forever," he said. But Sarah felt only hollowness. What good was changing the system if it cost everything human in the process? Harrington was arrested on the 4th day, charged with perverting the course of justice, conspiracy, and misconduct in public office. The image of him being led away in handcuffs should have been satisfying, but Sarah was reading her father's journal to her confused mother, trying to anchor her in better memories. Marcus returned daily, bringing Amara and home-cooked Nigerian meals that filled the sterile hospital room with warmth. "You saved us," he said simply. "My daughter still has her father because of your courage." "But at what cost?" Sarah responded, watching Liu sleep fitfully. "The cost of truth is always high," Marcus replied, his medical training and personal experience lending weight to his words. "But the cost of lies is higher. It just gets paid more slowly, over generations. Your mother paid it for 20 years. Amara would have paid it for the rest of her life. You chose to pay it all at once, to end the cycle." That evening, Liu had a moment of complete clarity. She gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "My brave daughter," she said in English, each word deliberate. "I'm not broken because you told the truth. I'm broken because I lived with lies for so long. Your father would be so proud. I am so proud. Now let me rest." The Attorney General announced the next morning that all of Harrington's cases would be reviewed, that Marcus Adeyemi would receive full compensation and a formal apology, that new safeguards would be implemented to prevent judicial corruption. It was everything Sarah had fought for, but she heard the news from a hospital chair, holding her mother's hand as Liu retreated further into the safety of memory. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the renovated Crown Court, where her father had been sentenced 23 years ago. The room had been transformed into a memorial space for victims of miscarriage of justice, and today was its dedication. Liu sat in a wheelchair in the front row, her mind clearer now thanks to treatment, though she still had days when the past felt more real than the present. The memorial wall bore 137 names, every person wrongfully convicted in cases connected to Harrington's network. David Chen's name was inscribed in polished brass, finally acknowledged as innocent by the system that had destroyed him. Below each name was a single line describing who they had been beyond their cases. Beloved father, dedicated teacher, compassionate healer. Marcus Adeyemi spoke first, his medical license fully restored, his reputation rebuilt through the patients who'd rallied to support him. "Injustice is a disease that spreads through silence," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived its worst symptoms. "Sarah Chen gave us the cure, truth, spoken loudly enough that it couldn't be ignored. Amara had been accepted to Oxford to study law, determined to become the kind of prosecutor her father had needed. She read a poem she'd written, each line a testament to the families who'd stood together in that courtroom, refusing to let their losses be forgotten. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Emma Walsh, reinstated to the Metropolitan Police with full honors and now heading a new unit investigating judicial misconduct, presented Sarah with a commendation. "Journalism at its finest doesn't just report what happened," she said. "It changes what happens next." But the most powerful moment came when Liu was wheeled to the podium. Her voice was fragile but clear, speaking the words she'd prepared with Sarah's help. "My husband David believed in two things, the power of truth and the strength of family. For 20 years I had only the second. My daughter gave me back the first. To all the families here, remember, our loved ones are more than their verdicts. They are the love they gave us, the values they taught us, the courage they inspire in us still." William Harrington was serving 12 years in prison, his network of corrupt officials dismantled, his legacy destroyed. He'd applied to serve his sentence in protective custody, afraid of meeting the innocent men he'd sent to prison. Sarah had received one letter from him, a rambling justification of his actions as protecting British society from dangerous elements. She'd burned it unread after seeing the first line. The Guardian had established the Chen Fellowship for Investigative Journalism, ensuring Sarah's work would continue through new generations of reporters. She'd returned to work part-time, focusing on systemic reform rather than individual cases, trying to heal the system rather than just expose its wounds. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah pushed her mother's wheelchair into the afternoon sun. London stretched before them, the same city that had taken everything and eventually given something back, not justice exactly, but acknowledgement. The Thames flowed past, carrying the reflections of buildings old and new, institutions that would outlive them all, but might perhaps be a little more honest because of their sacrifice. "Are you at peace, Mama?" Sarah asked in Mandarin. Liu reached up to touch her daughter's hand. "Peace isn't forgetting the pain," she replied. "It's knowing the pain meant something." They made their way to Whitechapel Cemetery, where a new headstone had been placed on David Chen's grave. No longer did it bear the shame of a criminal conviction. Now it read simply, "David Chen, 1956-2003, beloved husband and father, truth seeker, finally free." Sarah knelt and placed her father's journal at the base of the stone, its pages having served their purpose. The truth it contained was now part of public record, legal history, and most importantly, their family's restoration. As she stood, she felt Amara's hand slip into hers. This young woman who'd become like a sister through shared trauma and triumph. "What happens now?" Amara asked. Sarah looked at the gathering crowd. Families of the vindicated, journalists covering the memorial, officials promising reform, and ordinary citizens who'd learned that justice required vigilance. Marcus stood with Liu, pointing out architectural details of the courthouse, keeping her mind engaged and present. Emma Walsh coordinated with security, ensuring everyone's safety. James Morton interviewed survivors, documenting their stories for posterity. "Now we remain watchful," Sarah answered. "Truth isn't a destination, it's a practice. Every day, in every courtroom, in every investigation, in every story told or untold. We've shown it's possible to fight back, but the fight never really ends." As they left the cemetery, Sarah's phone buzzed with a new tip. A judge in Manchester exhibiting suspicious patterns in immigration cases. The old Sarah would have immediately started investigating, but the woman she'd become understood that truth-telling was a marathon, not a sprint. She forwarded the tip to the Chen Fellowship recipients, the next generation of investigators. That evening, in Liu's flat, 3 families gathered for dinner: the Chens, the Adeyemis, and Emma Walsh, with her partner and children. The table groaned under dishes from 3 cultures, voices mixed in multiple languages, and laughter. Somehow, impossibly, there was laughter. Liu directed the meal preparation with the sharp clarity she had on good days, treating Marcus and Emma like the family they'd become. As Sarah watched her mother teach Amara to fold dumplings, she thought about the price of truth and the value of justice. They weren't the same thing, she'd learned. Justice was what the system offered when it worked. Truth was what remained when the system failed. And love, the fierce, protective love of families refusing to surrender to lies, that was what made the fight worthwhile. The reporter had tried to warn them, and though the verdict had already been in, the truth had ultimately spoken louder. Not in time to save David Chen or spare Marcus Adeyemi his ordeal, but in time to save Amara's faith in fighting back, to restore Liu's dignity, and to ensure that William Harrington's corruption would end with his generation. In the window, Sarah had placed a small sign, visible to passers-by. Truth is patient. Truth is persistent. Truth prevails. Udum, it was her father's favorite saying, translated from Chinese, now proven right after 2 decades of doubt. The reporter had warned them. The verdict had been predetermined, but in the end, truth had the last word. As London settled into night, sirens wailing in the distance, the city's endless drama continuing, Sarah Chen sat at her laptop and began typing, "The work of justice is never complete." It was the opening line of her book, the full story of her investigation, with all proceeds going to families affected by wrongful convictions. The Guardian would serialize it, universities would study it, and somewhere perhaps another young journalist would read it and understand that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that cost us everything to tell. Liu's voice drifted from the kitchen, singing an old Mandarin lullaby she used to sing to Sarah, now teaching it to Amara. The melody was sad but beautiful, a song about loss that somehow spoke of hope. It was the perfect soundtrack for their imperfect victory, a reminder that even in systems designed to silence truth, human voices could still rise, still resonate, still inspire others to speak. The reporter had tried to warn them. She had succeeded, and in that success, despite all its costs, lay the seed of redemption, not just for her father's memory, but for the very concept of justice itself. The verdict had been in before the trial began, but the final judgment belonged not to corrupt judges, but to history. And history would remember Sarah Chen as the reporter who refused to let lies become truth, no matter the cost. The end.